Hey, good morning, everybody. I'd like to thank you for attending our Talking Tech webinar series. I know that we've had a couple of these and we're continuing to follow up on our monthly webinar series. We're really excited to announce a new segment. This month, we're going to be talking about ZTNA and microsegmentation and what can that can afford from a security perspective, kind of piggybacking into the security items that we talked about last month, kind of demystifying that alphabet soup of security. I know ZTNA was mentioned in there, Zero Trust Network Access. So we're going to continue to expand upon that with ZTNA, a deeper dive into ZTNA and microsegmentation. As always, we have myself, but this week we have Sean, who is the Director of Security Technology and Strategy for Akamai Technology. Sean, I'll let you kind of introduce yourself, give us a little background. I see you have some pretty big letters behind that name, CISSP, CFE. So give us a little background about yourself.
Sure. First, thank you for having me. Very happy to be here today. Been in security for about 20 years now. Worked for security vendors for about 17 of those. I've been with Akamai for 12. I kind of started at a more technical position in professional services, actually implementing our security solutions and helping. This was back when we didn't have a SOC or managed services, so we were asked to help attacks against attacks. So I've helped companies with attacks against hacktivism, state-sponsored fraud. And my recent position or my current position is really helping with the direction of our security strategy. So I go out and I talk to a lot of security thought leaders about the challenges that they're facing now, and then going back to our product group, making sure that we're meeting those challenges for today, but also keeping an eye on what's going to come in the future. And that means keeping an eye on new technologies as companies are embracing them, as well as the ever-evolving threat landscape.
Perfect. Well, I think then you might be the right person to talk to about ZTNA and microsegmentation. So I guess without further ado, let's get right into it. So let's kind of talk a little bit. What is Zero Trust Network Access?
So when you look at kind of the traditional way of connecting to a network, that's usually done through like a VPN or virtual private network. And that was all about focusing on connecting machines to a network. And as we've seen in the last 10 or 12 years, that can be exploited. When you get access to an entire network and it's really focusing on the machine to the network, it means anybody who's compromised that machine or who possesses that machine has the potential to access that network. And we've seen some really big attacks over the years, causing billions of dollars in damages because of that vulnerability where somebody was able to compromise a machine and get access to that. Zero Trust Network Access is all about instead of machines to network, it's about connecting people to the applications that they actually need to access. So it's about doing a good job of authenticating, usually with multi-factor authentication, maybe single sign-on, and then authorization, making sure that they're only going to have access to the applications that they're supposed to have access to. So, sales teams might have a certain subset of applications, engineering will have a different subset, but we're able to granularize the security down to just being able to access the application. So they can't get access to the network, they can't see at the network level, they can't do scans of the network, they only get access to what they need. And a lot of that takes place before they even get into the network. So the authentication, the authorization happens outside of the network, and then they're actually just brought straight into those applications that they need access to.
Yeah, and Sean, I think it's safe to say that it kind of extends past what historically network engineers would have thought of as their perimeter. They see a SaaS application like a SharePoint or in the cloud or a ServiceNow or a Salesforce, and they think, well, that's not behind my firewall, that's not behind my infrastructure. How do I protect that? I think ZTNA has really carved out a path for protecting not just those applications that I house internally, not what I'm responsible for necessarily from a security perspective, but also greater SaaS applications, which, the world continues to move further and further in that direction. There's less things on site, there's less infrastructure on site, and there's less applications being housed and managed by the companies internally.
Correct. And I think it also simplifies, as we're seeing companies moving towards cloud environments as well. It's not the data center anymore, as you mentioned, it's SaaS, it's cloud environments. So having a solution that can kind of keep up with how your network's kind of evolving is also critical.
Yeah, and so I just threw together this little kind of simple diagram to kind of discuss how ZTNA looks, and I think this is probably a safe representation. So we have those remote users that classically we've thought about with VPN, and I think one of the other things that's I guess gets into ZTNA or more of the microsegmentation line is, you know, once a user has access to a VPN, generally, I mean, they can be dumped in a very specific VLAN, but normally they have the keys to the kingdom. Once they're in on VPN, they can access whatever is allowed access through that VPN. They can crawl the network, as you said. But with some of these other items, I've seen ZTNA be put in place to isolate vendors to pieces of equipment, whether that's in the manufacturing space or whether that's in the IoT space, things like that. I think one of the biggest things that comes to mind that could have really protected ZTNA could have really protected, or is kind of the framework for probably what people think about in a way to stop this attack is what I think it was maybe 7 or 8 years ago, the Target breach that occurred via a VPN connection from an HVAC provider that was there to manage HVAC. They came in, they rode in on that network from a compromised credential, and from there was able to implement and crawl the network, implement their malware, and steal a whole bunch of credit card information.
Yes, that's a great example of that. That one actually went up into the billions as far as the damages, and definitely had a ripple effect between not just that information being released, but all the credit. Like, there were so many credit card numbers being compromised that even the credit card the Visas and the MasterCards of the world having to create new cards. There was a cost to them that was significant, trying to replace all those credit card numbers. And I would actually say that most people think of ZTNA for remote users, but you can use it inside the network as well, and it allows you to kind of continuously lock down your network if you're forcing everybody through ZTNA, not just remote, but also even if they're in the network, bringing them out, getting them authorized, and then bringing them specifically into the applications.
Yeah, I totally agreed. I think this is a way I think classically we would have called it like a layer 2 firewall or access listing, but it's a way to really negate inter-VLAN traffic and get between that inter-VLAN traffic and really segment that as well.
Yeah.
So with that, we'll kind of get into why ZTNA. So what are the primary benefits of implementing ZTNA into an enterprise environment, Sean? I know we just kind of touched on maybe some of those at a high level, but let's talk a little bit deeper about what really benefits a customer might see out of implementing ZTNA into their infrastructure.
Well, I think a lot of it comes down to the granularity of what you can do with ZTNA. The ability to only provide certain access to certain applications is critical, especially when we talk about zero trust, we have to assume breach, right? So even if they were able to get around all these other controls, they still only have access to a certain subset of applications if they were able to get through everything else. The ability to do multi-factor authentication, single sign-on, means you've got stronger authentication before they get brought into the network, which allows you to make sure that they are who they say they are. So it's not just about, do you have the machine? It's not just about the credentials. And we've seen a lot of attacks recently where credentials got people into networks because there wasn't a multi-factor authentication mechanism. And then the other ability that you're able to do is you can do device health checks in many of these solutions, which means you can make sure that the devices that your end users or that your employees are using are up to date, that they don't have certain software or they do have certain software installed on them. So you can really gate the devices that you're going to allow on your network, along with the users and the different applications that they have access to.
Yeah, and I think we're definitely seeing as the culture shifts and work remote, hybrid work. So we're seeing that really big emphasis on when, the whole remote worker, VPN accessibility, SaaS applications, highly available applications. But I think the other emphasis that we're seeing a lot of is on the BYOD tech. Really that line between this is my work device and my personal device, I think is a lot more blurred for many people than what was maybe previously. And I think even in that situation, I think as you see companies continue to grow and evaluate maybe how they do business, how their remote individuals work, how they acquire assets, I think we're going to continue to see a bigger push on, bring the device you're comfortable with. If you're a Mac person, bring your Mac because we're SaaS apps and we don't care what you run it on, or bring your Windows device or whatever the case may be. So I think ZTNA really helps from a administrator's perspective. It really helps make their lives a lot easier with those types of things with the health checks.
Yes.
So a lot of benefits to ZTNA. What are what are generally our common challenges when faced with implementing ZTNA? What do you see a lot of in terms of getting this implemented, getting it maintained? Where do you see the challenges?
Well, obviously, you're introducing complexity into an environment. So there's increased complexity. Certain legacy applications might not be ideal for a ZTNA environment. So you kind of have to make sure that whatever solution you're getting into covers the different connections. We usually see that a lot with like engineering, as far as what they're able to access, and we see legacy connections there a lot more than like in the sales environment. So having an understanding of the applications that you need connections to and making sure the solution can do that. And then obviously there's kind of a change in behavior, right? So we've got employees that are used to connecting a certain way, and now we're kind of changing that to a different way. And so there's a little bit of a learning curve there. Although, to be quite honest, I mean, we use it at Akamai. I don't want to go back to virtual private networks. We use multi-factor with single sign-on. I use my phone to get in most of the time, right? So I don't even have to worry about, typing in my password. I can get in much quicker doing it that way. So, I think just adding additional complexity. You also need people who understand the application. So once you start getting these granular controls, you've got to be able to actually configure them. So, what are the applications that your sales team should have, or your support team should have, or your developers should have? Somebody needs to manage that, and so that is a kind of an additional layer that has to be added to that.
Okay. Yeah, and I mean, I think one of the other questions I would have around that, which leads into the next bullet point, is, we see these ever sophisticated cyber attacks continuing. And I think a lot of times I like to discuss security as in layers or like an onion with customers. And really, ZTNA is one piece of that onion, but I think it actually evolves into more pieces of that onion, whether that's at the user level with authentication, whether that's at the microsegmentation level, whether that's allowing them access. So, how does ZTNA really play a role in that with the ever changing environment of the threat landscape and those threats becoming more sophisticated? Do you see, I mean, I think we're going to get to a point where ZTNA really has to be there to really protect any sort of enterprise environment from any level of attack it's somewhat sophisticated in nature.
Yeah, if you look at the threat landscape right now, phishing emails is one of the biggest attacks out there. In addition to that, if you're looking at websites and malicious websites, the number one category of malicious websites is phishing. There's definitely a focus on getting credentials. We're also seeing attacks on trying to get around multi-factor authentication. We're seeing attacks that use social engineering. In fact, we saw some really big attacks in Las Vegas that was getting convinced a help desk to give credentials. Now you wonder, like, ZTNA could have stopped that if there was multi-factor single sign-on at that. And then even if they had compromised all of that, they figured out a way to get around it, you're still limiting them to what they do have access to and into the network. So the more we have to assume breach, the more it makes sense to them to limit what they can access if they get into the network.
Yeah. So, I mean, that leads to kind of the next conversation. So we've talked about the ZTNA portion. So I'd like to dig a little bit deeper into the why microsegmentation. So, for the audience that might not be familiar, What is microsegmentation? Why is it an essential component to the zero trust architecture?
So as I mentioned, when you're dealing with zero trust, the part of it is assuming breach. So if we know that there's somebody that's going to be able to get into the network, we need to limit what they're able to do within the network. Segmentation is all about segmenting out your network and being able to provide rules around the different segments to limit access to critical assets. A great example of this kind of in the real world would be segmenting out that we see in shipping. The modern cargo ship has about 10 to 20 different cargo hold compartments. And the reason why they do that is so that if one of those compartments floods, they can close that down, and it limits the exposure of the flooding to a single compartment. So if the ship gets breached, and I'm using that term intentionally, what you're able to do is you're able to isolate that breach to those compartments, close off those compartments, and the ship can continue to sail on. It's the same thing with the network. We want to be able to limit the access that an attacker can get into, so that we're protecting the critical assets, we're protecting the data, like the crown jewels of the organization, so that somebody can't simply get in and go straight to the database where all your customer information is, or your accounting software. So segmentation is all about isolating that down and creating different segments. But it's also about providing visibility that is now critical. Now that we have to assume breach, we also have to understand what's normal traffic and identify abnormal traffic. And microsegmentation can do that if that segmentation has things like machine learning and automation in it. It can actually track the data flows across the network, especially if it's able to look at it from an application layer, and understand when there is an anomaly within the network, such as a possible ransomware attack, be able to alert individuals and allow the company to quickly push out additional rules if they need to lock down more if they're seeing a possible intrusion attack. Plus, that visibility gives you the ability to do hunting at a network level. So hunting is a lot more of a proactive approach to security, but it's a great way to look at identifying possible vulnerabilities, identifying advanced persistent threat actors before they trigger some other security solution.
Yeah, I think hunting's a lot more easier it's kind of in the namesake, micro segmentation. It's a lot easier to hunt inside of a micro environment where you know where that potential threat is coming from than it is to go, well, we have to crawl the entire network to figure out where this is coming from.
Exactly.
It narrows that approach in your search initially. So I know you mentioned some real world results, but as far as that is concerned and microsegmentation, can you mention or can you talk a little bit about how you've seen this actually improve the security posture within an organization? If you can get into, at some level, an example, you might have to, spare a name, but anything that you've seen. And then I would say two sides of that, the security posture of, if you could talk about maybe a security posture of internal resources, but then if you have an example or a real world use case of external security posture resources, things like SaaS applications. I know that, the microsegmentation can be extended out, again, like we talked about, to those cloud apps.
Yeah. And there's actually a lot of other things, other use cases that segmentation can address beyond security that I just kind of want to touch upon real quick, such as segmenting out your development environment from your production environment. We've seen issues where they went public, where you see news articles where somebody put content that wasn't supposed to be on the production website, and it got on the production website, and you find out that it wasn't supposed to happen. Segmentation can prevent that. Compliance is another area where if you've got if you were an organization that has to have certain applications that are PCI compliant, you can segment out those applications. You can have those more stringent security on that, but it doesn't affect the rest of the networks. And then one of the use cases I would give an example of is with certain microsegmentation, especially the software-based ones, that visibility that you have really comes into play with like zero-day attacks. So I'll give an example, and it's starting to get more and more outdated, but Log4j I use because everybody has very vivid memories of it. Companies that had our security microsegmentation was able to query all their assets to find out which one was using Log4j. Then they were able to, once the assets reported back that yes, they have it on the asset, they're able to quickly create a ring fence around all those servers and put in some simple rules like, hey, don't go to the internet. We're going to prevent that from, or limit, where they're going. So maybe they can only go to their update server. And they were able to lock down very quickly those assets that were vulnerable. And that gives the company time to figure out what they want to do. If there's a patch available, patch it. If not, how do you make that decision on what you're going to do for that vulnerable process? And that turned, I think most of us remember, some of these companies took weeks and even months to kind of isolate that, figure it out, and mitigate. That turns, having a security control in play within a couple of hours really helped a lot of those companies when it came to protecting against 0 days. Another one was obviously ransomware. We saw a company that I'm sure if we're all familiar with the Colonial Pipeline attack that happened several years ago. The same attackers attacked the company that was working with us, and what happened was an employee took the laptop home, put it on their home environment. Within the weekend, something happened, and the machine had malware in it and was compromised. And then on Monday morning, they came back and they connected to the corporate network, and immediately that laptop was trying to reach out to hundreds of different servers and assets within the network. That behavior was flagged because it's very anomalous. I mean, when you start to have visibility to the data flows, this behavior like that becomes really obvious because it's just so unusual. The company was already controlling and protecting their critical assets, but when they started to see that activity, they saw the visibility. They knew what the attacker was doing. They was trying to reach out on 2 separate ports to see if they could RDP into a machine, for example. And they were able to put out some rules very quickly across all the segments that said, hey, laptops shouldn't RDP to other machines. And they were able to lock down, based off of that attacker's behavior, they were able to lock down access from those ports and protocols. And they turned what could have potentially been another Colonial Pipeline incident into a single machine with malware, which is easily something you can take offline and resolve. And it's a much easier way to handle that than have to handle the potential ransomware attack.
Yeah. And I mean, I think one thing that I've seen with microsegmentation, I think you would agree, Sean, I think it's safe to say that I think it to me, it feels like it takes kind of these older, maybe considered more on-prem heavy networking things that everybody was supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
So, segmenting out desktop, segmenting out wireless, segmenting out server environment, all on their own network, their own VLAN, and then performing access lists or also placing firewalling between those VLANs, user devices being on PVLANs. I think it takes a lot of those classic kind of very heavy, very difficult to administer networking concepts and really does make them incredibly agile and incredibly easy to implement. I think about how difficult it would have been 10 years ago to implement, say, a wide scale suppression of RDP across your environment. But with
Right.
micro segmentation, it's incredibly easy. Previously you'd be pushing policies. You might use, some sort of solution where you're utilizing maybe SCCM to push those policies or GPOs or some RMM tool that you've got in place. Now you're really blocking it at the network level, and it's a couple of simple clicks, the same way you would block it at a firewall level.
Exactly. I mean, the simplification is so critical. I mean, segmentation isn't new. What's newer or what's better about it than it has been 5 or 6 years ago is the ability to execute it, as you said, with flexibility. I mean, trying to keep track of hundreds of VLANs is really complex. And trying to do everything at a network level, not to mention the fact that you now have a cloud environment that you might have to manage as well. It's difficult to implement. And I think nowadays, the microsegmentation makes it a lot easier to implement and to control. So you have a single console you can push everything out from, right?
So, I mean, again, just with like ZTNA, we're singing a lot of praises of this, but generally, what are some of the challenges you see in implementing it? I understand it is a mind shift in the way that you're doing things potentially, but what do you see as some of the other challenges that face customers that attempt to go through the process of implementing microsegmentation?
So there's two different types of microsegmentation. There's kind of your hardware network way of doing it, and there's a software-based way of doing it. And I'll kind of give pros and cons to each one. The network way of doing that, that's where you're kind of relying on the firewalls and you're relying on your switches and routers. And when you're doing it that way, it's a lot more rigid. It's at the network level. It's not looking at the application layer. If you're changing in things like Kubernetes and containers where they're brought up and brought back down, become more challenging. And then obviously, as you get more into hybrid or cloud environments, that's not something that you can easily continue, kind of push towards that as well. So it has its cons as far as it's not as flexible as the software-based. Software-based gives you the application visibility, gives you an agent so that you can do things like query the agent to see if there's something on the machine. But then we run into issues where, what about IoT devices? What about OT devices? There's always kind of that friction. There's a hesitation of one more software agent on a machine. There's a lot of benefits, and I think that there's a lot more pros to that than cons, but those are definitely things you have to take into consideration. And there's workarounds for that, such as tapping into a switch and intercepting that traffic there. But those are definitely things that you have to take into consideration when you're deploying these solutions is, when you want to do this, you got to keep in mind what your environment's like. Do you have a hybrid environment or a cloud environment? Do you have assets that you can put agents on? Or are you really, is a lot